Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Voices of AAPI Communities briefing as we unveil new findings from the AAPI Data AP-NORC survey. My name is Kevin Hirano. I'm the Deputy Director of APIA Vote, and I'll be co-hosting this month's briefing with Naomi Takuyan-Underwood, the Executive Director of AAJA, alongside our presenting partner, AAPI Data. This series spotlights unprecedented insights into the diverse views and policy priorities held by AAPIs across the country. For the first time, we have access to in-depth, real-time data on the views within our communities. These surveys will equip you with data-driven understanding of where our communities stand on pressing issues and help inform our efforts to engage them.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm Naomi Takuyan-Underwood, Executive Director of the Asian American Journalists Association. We're so privileged to partner with AAPI Data and API Vote to co-host this monthly series about the newest data coming out of AAPI-NORC at the University of Chicago. Thanks to AAJ's mission, it really is about making sure that our journalists have access to these resources and these experts so they can better report on AAPI communities. And we encourage you to use the Q&A feature on the webinar as Karthik presents the data, as the API Data team presents. Drop your questions in there and we will get to them in the Q&A portion after the presentation. Thank you. And we'll get right to it. Karthik and API Data team.
Thank you, Naomi. Hi, everyone. I'm Fontaine Lowe, Deputy Director at API Data. Karthik will be sharing the results from the poll shortly, but I just have a couple things to say. One is, many thanks to Kevin and Naomi for your ongoing partnership in this monthly briefing that we've had. I think is the third or fourth one so far. And also many thanks to the Associated Press and NORC with whom we partner on this poll. I wanted to just insert myself to welcome or kind of share the thrilling news that we now have a Director of Communications, Nicholas Turton. We are so thrilled to have him, as we know that getting the data in the hands of those who can use it is so important. Communications in our work is so important. And so we're so excited to have him on the team. Nicholas, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself before passing to Karthik.
Yeah, and I'll also ask if we can stop the screen share for a sec, folks, so that Nicholas can fill your screen.
Wow, close up. Thanks, Fontaine. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Turton. I use he, him pronouns, and as Fontaine mentioned, I'm the new Director of Communications for AAPI Data. Excuse me. I'm really excited to be here and be in this space with you all. Our AP-NORC polls are a really exciting partnership, and really excited to be working in partnership with all of our partners here in regard to amplifying this data. So a little bit more about myself and my background. Before joining the team here at AAPI Data, I was on the comms team at the Trevor Project. And for those of you who don't know, the Trevor Project is the leading suicide prevention organization for LGBTQ+ young people. And there I did a lot of work amplifying our research, the organization's research and advocacy efforts, doing a lot of intersectional polling of LGBTQ+ youth in terms of the current political environment, amplifying peer-reviewed research on intersectional identities of LGBTQ young folks, including disaggregated data on AAPI identifying LGBTQ young folks. So really excited to bring that experience from that prior work. And then before that, I was working at Benton Communications, a social change communications agency, helping amplify organizations, foundations, and government agencies all working towards social change. And there I was the key communications strategy lead on our account work with Stop AAPI Hate. So really excited to merge all of these experiences and bring that background here to AAPI Data. And I'll drop my email into the chat. I know I'm really looking forward to working with reporters and journalists on amplifying our data, making sure that the data gets in the right folks' hands and how we storytell around that. So I'll go ahead and drop my contact info, and without further ado, I'll pass it back over to Karthik.
Great, thank you so much, Nicholas. And thank you everyone for joining us. We will get right to the findings. I do want to give a shout out to someone else who is in the webinar who is Akhil Vora, who just joined us this week. Is that right? A week ago. He joined us a week ago as our Director of Policy. So we have amazing talent at the AAPI data team and we're excited about the year ahead. Let's go to the next slide. So just to say a little bit about the API Data AP-NORC partnership, we'll go to the next slide. This partnership leverages the comparative strengths of each of our organizations at API Data, at the Associated Press, and at NORC at the University of Chicago. So at API Data, in addition to me, we have others like Janelle Wong, and together we have many years of survey research experience in our communities. We also bring expertise in social science research and community engaged research under a framework that we call DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. And this survey partnership is a great example of that. The survey partnership itself is about the data, but the work that we do with AJA and API Vote, AJA on the narrative side with journalists as key partners, and then API Vote on the civic engagement side to make sure that our data and insights, in addition to accurate narratives about our communities, can lead to meaningful action. In our survey partnership, we work with the Associated Press, which has longstanding expertise in data journalism, high trust and credibility, as well as wide reach through hundreds of local, state, and national publications. And then finally, NORC at the University of Chicago, which is a global leader in objective, nonpartisan research with a stellar reputation in social science and survey methodology, as well as a longstanding partnership with the Associated Press on data-informed storytelling. So we're grateful, as always, for that partnership. Let's go to the next slide. So key findings from the report that was released hours ago. So this was released at 1 p.m. Eastern time today. So the key findings in that report that you can find at ap-norc.org, and pretty soon you'll find it at apidata.com as well, /surveys. Here are the 4 key findings. First, that household expenses have increased in the last year for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. 38% describe their financial situation as poor, and 65% stay the same in terms of the national economy. So we look both in terms of people's own household financial situation as well as how they rate the overall economy. When it comes to healthcare and healthcare costs, it's interesting. Only 16% say that they hold some form of medical debt, but 40% have little or no confidence that they could pay for an unexpected medical expense. And 78% think Congress should tackle healthcare costs. In fact, that is the highest congressional priority when it comes to pocketbook issues, if you will. So that's not something you're hearing a lot about right now, but chances are, as we go through this year, especially this election year, healthcare costs and the ability to cover healthcare costs as a key policy priority and perhaps a political priority, something to watch out for. Finally, for the first time ever, we have data on where our community stands when it comes to the Israel-Gaza conflict. 49% believe the United States is not supportive of Palestinians in the conflict with Israelis, while 40% think that the US is too supportive of Israelis. There's a lot of details when we disaggregate that we will get to during this briefing. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the charts that you'll see at AP-NORC and in the survey report. Let's go to the next slide. Right, in terms of having confidence in their financial situation, we see that AAPI adults, so this combines Asian American and Pacific Islanders, that's the way that AP-NORC reports out the data. We see that the results are about in line with the US population, except in a couple of instances, right? In terms of being confident in having enough savings for retirement, we see that APIs are slightly better off than the US average. And slightly worse off when you look at you'll be able to find a good job if you wanted to. Only 19% of API adults say that they're extremely confident or very confident about that, whereas 27% of US adults say the same. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of household expenses and debt and income and savings compared to a year ago, we see patterns that are similar as for the US average, where, especially if you look at the household expenses, finding there about 2/3 say that their household expenses are higher now than a year ago, which makes sense that inflation is still a thing. Even if the rate of inflation has gone down, it still has meant that many Asian American and Pacific Islander households have higher household expenses than when compared to a year ago. Debt is not as severe within our population when you look at it on average. But again, later on, we will be able to disaggregate to see important variation within our community. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of priorities, when it comes to pocketbook issues, as I've mentioned before, cost of healthcare is the highest priority. When Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are asked to rank different priorities for Congress to tackle this year as it relates to financial issues. Not far behind is the cost of housing. And so we drill deeper into both of these issues later on in our presentation to see if there's any interesting variation within our community on these issues. Let's go to the next slide. And then finally, we have findings connected with the Israel-Gaza conflict, as well as when it comes to US foreign policy. So when it comes to whether the United States is too supportive, not supportive enough, or about right, AAPI adults are more likely than the US average to say that the US is too supportive of the Israelis. So that's the top finding that you see there, right? The 48% versus 32%. And when it comes to saying that they're not supportive enough of Israelis, only 15% of API adults say that, compared to 25% of US adults. About right, the findings are about similar. On the flip side, when you look at US support for Palestinians, close to a majority. So 49% of APIs say that the US is not supportive enough of Palestinians in the conflict with Israel, compared to 31% of US adults who stayed the same. There are 17% of Asian American Pacific Islander adults who say that the US is too supportive of Palestinians, compared to 29% of US adults who say the same. So we have an advantage here. So not only do we have the survey of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we're able to look at identically worded questions that AP-NORC has asked in other surveys to be able to compare Asian American Pacific Islander adults with US adults more generally. We did ask 2 additional questions that were not asked in other surveys by AP-NORC in terms of Jewish communities in the United States and Muslim communities in the United States. And what we find is that API adults say that there's not enough, 26% say that there's not enough support for Jewish communities in the United States, whereas 44% say that it's about right. 27% say there is too much support. When it comes to Muslim communities in the United States, again, you're starting to see something approaching close to a majority. 45% say that the United States is not supportive enough of Muslim communities in the United States. So this is fairly clear findings where our community stands, where essentially our community is saying that we need to have greater support for Muslim communities in the United States and greater support for Palestinians than what the US is doing right now. Let's go to the next slide. So there's some important partisan differences to be mindful of, and you can read about that more in the report, especially when it comes to differences in thinking about levels of support for Muslim communities in the United States. Those are some pretty big partisan differences within our community. Let's go to the next slide. So before we go into a deep dive and we disaggregate the findings, we also asked questions about opinion about Israel, mirroring a question that AP-NORC had asked of US adults. And we then replicated that question for other countries as well. And what you see here from top to bottom if there was a kind of warmth indicator, if you will, in terms of whether APIs think that this country is an ally that shares the US interests and values, you see the highest proportion at the top there, with Japan 55%, using that label to characterize Japan. The next label is a partner that the US should cooperate with, but that does not necessarily share its interests and values. So that's 31% there for Japan, right? And then you can look next at Israel, India, and China on those. When you flip valence and you look at not as an ally or a partner, but as a rival that the US should compete with, but that it's not in conflict with, that's the next finding. And then finally, an adversary that the US is in conflict with. So when you lay this out, first of all, in light of the Israel-Palestinian findings, we find that a supermajority, right? So 76% of API adults say that Israel is either an ally that shares the US interests and values, or is a partner that the US should cooperate with, but that doesn't share its interests and values. But on the flip side, when you look at China, and we'll disaggregate, I promise you, we will show you the disaggregated findings, the reverse is true. So among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, 70% say that China is either a rival that the US should compete with, but that it's not in conflict with, or that it's an adversary that the US is in conflict with. It's about split, right? But it's a very different picture that emerges in terms of where Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders see China vis-a-vis the United States, as opposed to, say, India, Israel, and Japan, that are more on the side of either an ally or a partner. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so deeper dives, let's disaggregate. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to whether the US is too supportive, not supportive enough, or about right in its support, here you'll see the color coding. Essentially anything in blue, people feel either good about US levels of support or saying that it's not supportive enough, that we need to increase the support. Whereas the red or the pink salmon indicates, whether it's too supportive. And we do find a difference here between Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, right? Where Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are less likely to say that the US is too supportive towards Israelis. We find some differences in terms of the not supportive enough category here that I would flag for your attention, where Asian Indians are among those most likely to say that the US is not supportive enough of Israelis in that Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Interestingly, though, later on, you'll find that Indians also say that the US is not supportive enough of Palestinians in the US, in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Let's go to the next slide. Now, some of these findings here will require some deeper digging and unpacking. So we'll need to probably replicate this in future surveys to see if this pattern holds. But amazingly, no difference in party ID in terms of whether we're being too supportive, not supportive enough, or about right in our support towards Israelis. And look at that when it comes to age. Now, this blows my mind. I would have thought that you would have found the biggest difference, and with the 18 to 29 age demographic saying that the US is too supportive of Israelis, but we're finding it in the 60 and over population. This is shocking to me, and something I think that we need to dig deeper into. Now, it's quite possible, as I was talking to my colleague Janelle Wong this morning, trying to make sense of what is going on here, maybe people 60 and over don't want war, because war and conflict increases inflation. Maybe that's what's going on. We don't know. We need to dig deeper to find out what is behind this finding. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to Palestinians, the flip side, we find that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are more likely than Asian Americans to say that the US is too supportive of Palestinians. This is a pattern we've seen before, where the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population tends to be more conservative, tends to be more Republican-leaning than the Asian American population. We also find some important differences by ethnicity here in terms of the not supportive enough finding. we find that Korean Americans and Asian Indians are up high on that metric when compared to Japanese Americans, where only 37% say that we're not supportive enough of Palestinians. Let's go to the next slide. Again, party ID is not as significant as we've seen before, but we do find that APIs who identify as Democrat are more likely than independents and Republicans to say that the US is not supportive enough of Palestinians. And the 60 and over here, remember the 60 and over, you saw too supportive of Israelis, but they're also saying too supportive of Palestinians. So that's the reason why one of the ways I'm interpreting this data is potentially to say that, you know, maybe it is reflective of this anxiety that the conflict in the Middle East is causing other issues, including inflation. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to different countries, you might think that people who come from that country will be the most supportive, and there is some truth to that. So if you're a Japanese American, you're more likely to say that Japan is an ally. But overall, you know, we find, you know, either if you look at ally or partner support across the board. That said, it's interesting that in terms of characterizing Japan as an ally, that there's a difference between Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders on that issue. 57% of Asian Americans say that Japan is an ally. Only 30% of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders say that Japan is an ally. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to Israel, again, you're seeing some differences, but Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders much more likely than Asian Americans to say that Japan is an ally. But, you know, lest we think, sometimes you hear this narrative that Asian Americans are divided politically because of the legacies of World War II and that we don't get along with each other. That's not true when you look at a whole bunch of other survey findings, but even on something like attitudes about whether Japan is an ally or not of the United States, you don't see much in the way of, sorry, that was on the Japan thing. But here, when it comes to Israel, you don't see much difference as well. I meant to say, you know, when it comes to the Japan finding. But in Israel, you do see some differences where Korean Americans are the most likely to say that Israel is an ally. But if you add up ally and partner together, there's not much in the way of differences across ethnicity. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to India, you see that those who are Indian American are more likely than others to say that India is an ally. But again, if you add up those two and you look at the blue bars, essentially, there's not much of a difference across ethnicity in terms of viewing India as an ally. And then let's go to the next slide. When it comes to China as an adversary or a rival, again, you don't see much of a difference. And in fact, if you look at Chinese Americans and you add up that 34% and that 32%, 66% of Chinese Americans see China either as a rival or as an adversary to the United States. By the way, this is very similar to the findings from the Pew Research Center earlier this year, which found that Chinese Americans themselves are similar to other Asian Americans that are similar to Americans in terms of how they see the US-China relationship. And I think this is really important for us to look at this data for each of these countries to understand that there's actually much more similarity across ethnic groups when it comes to how they see US foreign policy than some might assume, given the diversity within our community. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of support for Israelis looking beyond ethnicity, you know, we do see some differences here. Actually, this might be a repeat. Yes, I think this is a repeat. So let's go to the next slide. Some of these are repeats. These should have been skipped. For some reason, they're not being skipped. So let's keep going. Let's go to the next slide. We will find some additional findings here in terms of support for Muslim communities and Jewish communities. But we find that, you know, the finding that the US is not supportive enough of Muslim communities, there may be some speculation in terms of Islamophobia within our communities being a significant factor. But in fact, we find relatively high proportions across the board saying that the US is not supportive enough, including among Asian Indians, where, significant Hindu population, one might think that maybe Islamophobia is playing a significant role in the Asian Indian community, but we find that 54% of Asian Indians say that the US is not supportive enough of Muslim communities in the United States. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. And the next slide after that. Sorry, folks, some of these should have been skipped, but we'll make sure when we share the slide deck in the end that we don't have these duplicates. When it comes to economic priorities and what Congress should prioritize, we find some differences, but not much across the board. So when you look between Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans more likely than NHPIs to say that Congress should prioritize healthcare, but it's still a pretty high priority among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Not much in the way of nativity differences, language differences, or gender differences. Let's go to the next slide. We do find some differences by age, but interestingly enough, younger people, more likely than those 60 and over, saying that Congress should prioritize healthcare when it comes to healthcare expenses. So that's interesting. That's not what you typically expect to see, and that's something that we need to unpack further. Also, something we need to unpack is Republicans saying that Congress should be prioritizing healthcare costs. Not something you typically see. So this scrambles some of our assumptions and some of our thinking about Asian American and Pacific Islander Republicans and what some of their priorities might be. Let's go to the next slide. And this is looking at ethnicity. We find prioritization across the board, with very high prioritization among Filipinos when it comes to prioritizing healthcare expenses and having that as a major priority for Congress to tackle this year. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, I'll just let's go to these couple of slides and then we'll stop the screen share, Naomi, because I feel like there's a lot that we need to unpack here in the Q&A. But when it comes to prioritizing housing, we find some important differences by ethnicity here. So Filipinos more likely than Chinese Americans say that Congress should prioritize this. Not much in the way of differences between Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And let's go to the next slide. When it comes to differences by nativity, gender, and language, not much in the way of difference, except that when it comes to when English is spoken at home, that's probably the Filipino findings that's driving that, more likely to say that housing should be prioritized. I'd say let's stop the screen share and I'll just verbally say, what's left is when it comes to household debt, household expenses, we find that Filipinos rank higher than others, when it comes to some of those measures of financial distress, including on student debt as well. And Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders also rank higher than Asian Americans when it comes to those indicators of financial stress. So there's a lot of findings here to unpack. We dug a little bit deeper into the findings when it came to Israelis and Palestinians, and then when it came to Jewish and Muslim communities in the United States, because we think it's a matter of public interest. It's a matter of Asian American community interest as well, because we just haven't had this data before, and we have it for the first time. And it's, I think, to some people, I'll say myself included, I was surprised at some of the findings there, and it's very revealing. And I think it's important for us to see where our community stands on these issues.
Thanks so much, Karthik. Just a reminder, if you have a question, I see some folks have already put in their questions, to go ahead and drop it in the Q&A feature in the webinar. What stands out is sort of a clear contrast, Karthik, here about the fact that it uplifts AAPI communities as having similar concerns on what's known to be just American kitchen table issues, right? Healthcare, rising costs of living, savings. But in addition to that, there is a clear divergence of AAPI opinion on like the indicator, the level of US support for Palestinians and Israelis. And I'm just wondering, from seeing this initially, I know you just received the data recently, is what you've talked about it, what additional digging would you do, like from an API data perspective, as well as the fact that we are in a crucial presidential year?
Yeah, so I think so one of the things that we've done here is just look at what they call bivariate analyses. So we're just looking at cuts of the data by these different categories. One of the things I would want to do is to control for some of these factors to see what still remains statistically significant. For example, do you find ethnic differences after you control for party identification, for example? But before we get into those more sophisticated statistical analyses, I think the big finding staring at us in the face is like, Asian American and Pacific Islanders think that the US is not doing enough to support Palestinians and not doing enough to support Muslim communities in the US. Like, that is the headline. And I think we're seeing this in other communities of color too, right? And now you're seeing, for example, Black religious leaders now, right? The latest news reporting I heard is that there's going to be a march next month to say, calling for an immediate ceasefire and us to be doing more humanitarian work in Gaza. So I think the findings, if I had to say one thing, like before we get into any of the nuances, is Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and especially Asian Americans, believe that the US should be doing a lot more to be supportive of Palestinians. How does that play out electorally? Already people were looking at Michigan with a significant Arab American population. Guess what? Michigan also has a significant Asian American population. So that is going to make a difference in the election if the Biden administration does not do something, I would say, quick and meaningful to address the suffering that's going on with Palestinians in the Middle East right now. I think there is a way. I think what the findings show, though, is that Asian Americans they believe that the US is about right in its support of Israelis, right? And so it's not to kind of choose sides in a conflict, that it's one group over another. But the way I interpret the findings is that there is insufficient support right now for Palestinians, and there's insufficient support for Muslim communities in the US. So that, to me, is kind of like the blaring kind of neon sign, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of what the findings show before we get into the cuts of the data.
Right. And I think you've actually just answered Naila Budu's question from the Q&A. And that is really a headline, right? Because as we as a society have been grappling with this conflict, we've been having these kinds of conversations in our households as well. I'm going to actually go over to the second question from Sandy W. Is there any data on API women when it comes to healthcare access issues such as language or cultural barriers? If not, is that another sort of take at a deep dive later down the road?
Yeah, a point, we had mental health questions in the first survey that we did with AP-NORC. So I would encourage folks to go to apidata.com/surveys, where you will see our slide deck. I don't know right off. So that's on mental health. We've also, API Data has done work with the California Health Interview Survey, and we released a report last year when it came to different metrics of healthcare access, including mental health care, but other issues as well. So if you go to apidata.com/reports, you should be able to find those resources as well.
Thanks, Karthik. There's a question here from Molly of the National Partnership for Women and Families. Has a survey asked about views on or access to paid family and medical leave, or is that a topic you'd consider in the future?
That's a great question. I'll say, and at some point, I'd say let's pull Kevin into the mix here too, because
Yep.
So if we can get Kevin highlighted among us team, that would be great. Because in addition, as we think about the agenda for what kind of survey questions we should be asking in the future, there are two vehicles for this. So API Data and API Vote and AJC are going to continue our tradition of the Asian American Voter Survey. So those are some questions to potentially include there. I know that we're looking for partners for fundraising for that too. So there are ways that people, if they have ways that they can partner there. But AJA and API Vote and API Data are also going to be doing a survey on civic engagement using the Amplify API panel on which the AP-NORC survey is built. So those are great questions. I will say for API Data with our AP-NORC partnership, we are soon going to be in the field to be asking questions about abortion policy. So repro rights and issues are going to be coming up, as well as issues related to gender affirming care and the rights of transgender people. So watch out for that. I'm very excited. Again, these are survey questions that have never been asked in our communities. And some of these questions through our partnership with AP-NORC are new questions that have never been asked of US adults as well. So we're really excited about digging deeper there into, for example, when it comes to abortion policy and reproductive rights, we're digging not only in general what access should look like or what restrictions should look like, but what is the proper role of the federal government as opposed to state government when it comes to that aspect of healthcare access. So, but I'm going to ask Kevin,
Yeah.
especially at API Vote and some of the things you're hearing from community when it comes to healthcare, broadly speaking, but maybe repro or abortion, for example, or mental health care. What are some of the ways that you're seeing this play out?
And I
Yeah.
think that, Kevin, sorry, I
Oh.
also want to pull back too in terms of, your observations and how it's playing out in the field, but also, what from the data set that Karthik has presented, how does this inform your voter education and outreach strategies nationwide? And also, give us some insight into some key states where these battles around these policies are playing out locally. What does that look like for API Vote strategy?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we could say for repo rights, we saw that it's really an issue in what we saw what happened in Ohio, right? So we are seeing this as an activation issue, particularly for
Can you say more? Can you say more about what happened in Ohio, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean there was a ballot initiative in Ohio to make abortion legal from a constitutional standpoint in Ohio, which was passed by extremely surprised us that it definitely happened. We're seeing that across kind of many different states where reproductive rights and women's health rights are being threatened. And so for us, it's similar to what we're seeing. Asian Americans, we can't assume our political parties and politicals can't assume we're all Asians, and so we kind of know what you're doing. Our surveys, the invaluable nature of what Karthik and AP-NORC is doing is revealing that Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and Native Hawaiians really need to be engaged directly in the languages with our faces. And so the takeaway really from these results is really in two veins. The first one is obvious, I think, which is both parties really need to engage our communities directly. And that means, bringing in some of our Asian American voter survey data from 2022, we know from that less than half, half the respondents from our survey in 2022 were contacted by either party. That's significant. Asian API Vote, AAJA is really dedicated to making sure that our communities feel a part of our democracy, and that they're seeing content in language, they're seeing faces that they recognize, and that they're welcome to participate and be active members moving forward, right? Secondly, API Vote's approach is really about investing in and allowing our communities to engage directly as a trusted messenger in the issues that matter most to them. And so the results of these pollings are invaluable to give our partners on the ground. So we're in 32 states. We have, I think there's a question about whether geography differences, and I'll kick that to Karthik. But we know that there our partners in New York are definitely going to have different issues than our partners in Louisiana, in Florida, in Texas, in Oregon. And so we're sharing all of this data to inform their engagement to make sure that we are continuing to get our communities out enthusiastic and at the polls.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And speaking, I think there's a question here around methodology, because I know API Vote also does a lot of work in language and targeting our various API communities. How will the insufficient responses from the Vietnamese community be improved in future studies, Karthik?
Yeah, so this is something, folks, that the Amplify API panel has a lot of strengths, but it's not large enough to capture, I would say, the full diversity within all of our communities. And so in our judgment, the Vietnamese sample size is not large enough, nor, and it looks different from what we are expected to seeing over the last 15 years of survey research in this community. So that's why we don't want to release data that we don't have confidence in, but we are pushing Amplify API to increase its, not just increase the size of its Vietnamese sample, but also the diversity of its Vietnamese sample to more accurately reflect the community. So the kind of the back end kind of deeper digging into the sample it tells us that there needs to be more work done before we can accurately represent the Vietnamese American community through that data.
Yeah, and that would be such a valuable addition, because the Vietnamese community in a lot of ways has been sort of an outlier in terms of political leanings as well, right? So looking forward to, how NORC can be more resourced to expand their panel. There's a question here.
Yeah, one thing I will say, like quite apart from this, the Asian American voter survey that we'll do, when we've done in the past, especially because we also do a lot of telephone interviews, we've been able to not have the same issue. So I am hopeful that at the very least by June of this year, you will have disaggregated data for Vietnamese, if not through Amplify, through some other survey vehicle. And we at API Data and API Vote are committed to that.
Thanks, Karthik. There is a question. Arian Ahmadpour has a question around what sort of support is there any data on what sort of support respondents would like to see for Palestinians and the Muslim community?
Yeah. So when there was a report that we released, and by the way, if either Nicholas or Patricia or someone from the API data team can drop the link to Janelle Wong's blog post in the chat, that with AP-NORC we released another. We just have like so much data that's coming out, on a regular clip, and so that was a report on what are the policy priorities for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in 2024. Israel-Gaza was not high in that list of priorities, I will say, right? High on that list were inflation, and what was, okay, it was, I should know, inflation, immigration, the economy, like other aspects of the economy, and the environment. Those were the top 4 issues. Even something like abortion policy was not as high as those issues. So that's something important to keep in mind. Now, that said, we just said these are important issues for the country. How this plays out politically will depend on how the parties mobilize on the issue, how candidates kind of differentiate themselves on the issue. So, in the future survey, and Naomi, Janelle Wong and I got together earlier today to talk about some of the kinds of questions we should be asking, both in the Asian American Voter Survey, but also in the future collaboration that we have with AJA and API Vote, and absolutely to be able to figure out with multiple ways of asking questions to figure out the salience of these different issues in different contexts is definitely something we want to do.
Thanks, Karthik. And you referenced our collaboration here. AJA, API Vote, and API Data do have a parallel collaboration going on, trying to discover our AAPI respondents' relationship to and perception of the news, and digging into what entities and individuals and types of leaders are trusted messengers for our community, and also how their policy positions could affect how they think about going to the polls in their local and national elections. So more to come on that in the months to come. Emily in the chat had a question, but I think you previewed that the National Asian American Voter Survey will still be happening. And I think as far as questions from our attendees, I think we've covered all of them. And I believe that Kevin,
Yeah, I'll just get a couple of questions. There's one about API data, API women when it comes to civic engagement, past
okay.
Asian American voter surveys. We always have gender breakouts, and including on this too. It turns out it's interesting. Turns out that race matters more than gender in this country, right? Except for white men and white women. There's a big gender gap between white men and white women. But the gender gaps for other racial groups is not as strong, whereas racial gaps are very strong. That said, I think there are ways to think about ways that gender makes a difference in terms of gender of candidates. Absolutely, it makes a difference. And even the ways that issues get talked about. And we can dig deeper in terms of issue prioritization by gender, and we should. But so far, in all the research that I've done, Janelle Wong and others have done, is that, and this is maybe just the unfortunate reality of the US, where race and racism structures things so starkly that the effects, the kind of differences by race usually are much stronger than differences by gender within race.
And on that note, I just wanted to make sure everyone, Fontaine, we had talked earlier about this. If you could drop the link. I know that the AAPI data team is around for any further questions on this particular data set, but Fontaine will drop the link where you can find all of the additional information or the slides that you've seen here, some version of it. We hope that you have found this enlightening and that it informs your work. And we're also very thankful for the feedback, because it really is, like, in terms of how we think about these webinars, we really want to keep our dialogue an open feedback mechanism on how we're thinking about future surveys and where we need to think about additional questions and breakdowns that we maybe hadn't thought about before. So with that said, thank you all for joining us today.
Naomi, I just want to say too, the people dropped the links in the chat, but if folks have if you're a member of the press, please email press@apidata.com so we can answer your questions. If you're a community member and have questions, you can email info@apidata.com and we can answer your questions, your deep dive, nerd out questions. It might take us a little bit to do some of the more sophisticated statistical analyses, but some of the other analyses we will do our best. And then the slide deck will be available, but it might take us a minute to make sure that we're addressing some of the questions that have come up, to make sure that it's in all the slides that we have, that we share within a few days of every time we do one of these webinars.
Yeah. And one last word from the chat. Thank you, Daphne Kwok. I think the goal here is data-backed narrative plenitude, but also making sure that information about our community is statistically significant and methodologically defensible.
Yeah.
Thank you, Daphne, for attending. Thank you for your leadership in making sure that this data panels happen and that everybody has access to this kind of data.
Excellent. Well, are we closing it now? I guess one thing I'll just say with a note of gratitude, API Vote and API Data, we've been partnering for many years. So yes, if you hit either one of us on our media teams, we're often in conversation with each other in terms of data, how to make meaning of the data, and then who are the people on the ground that this data matters to, that it affects, but what I'll say is that I'm so thrilled, Naomi, that we're able to then kind of expand and deepen our partnership with AAJ this year, and to see your members in the, asking the important questions. Nyla, it's great to see you there. Thank you for your question. And I look forward to being more of a responsive resource to our community organizations, but also importantly our journalists, right, who are going to be critical to make sure that we have accurate narratives about our community, as opposed to narratives that are based on stereotype or false assumptions.
Karthik, this feels like Fellowship of the Rings. We keep trying to conclude.
Yes,
One
yes.
last plug, actually. No, you make a good point, and this reminds me that AJ is going to be working with API Vote. We do have a resource for producers and editors to be able to seek out AAPI community leaders and experts at ahastudio.org. We want to make sure that we have a centralized place for journalists to go and get to the source and get to the leadership that can speak for communities and on behalf of these issues. So if you are a community leader and expert, if you want to check it out and apply to be featured, please check it out at ahastudio.org. And we look forward to putting together a community-based resource for reporters to be able to cover our communities in a more nuanced and equitable way. So we look forward to engaging with you in numerous ways. We are very much grateful to be here with AAPI Data and API Vote.